In the rolling hills of the kingdom, a quiet farmer's wife becomes the target of a ruthless gang of outlaws. Unbeknownst to them, she's no ordinary woman. The moment they cross her path, they'll come to regret it, for she is the most feared archer in the kingdom. A woman whose skill with a bow has made her a legend. What happens next is a lesson the outlaws will never forget, as they learn that underestimating her was the biggest mistake of their lives. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button for our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Your support truly helps us share these hard-hitting stories with more people. The sun was beginning to set over the distant hills, casting long shadows across the valley as Rhona worked in the fields. The air was still warm from the late summer day, the earth beneath her feet soft from the earlier rain. She hummed a gentle tune as she harvested the last of the wheat, her mind wandering to the evening meal that awaited her and her husband, a simple life that she cherished despite its quiet monotony. But the serenity of the countryside was about to be shattered. A rustling from the trees near the edge of the field caught her attention, but she paid it little mind. Perhaps it was just a deer or some other small animal moving through the brush. She bent over to gather the last of the stalks, the peaceful rhythm of the evening settling over her once more. It was then that she heard it, a voice, low and threatening, cutting through the silence. "Hold it right there, woman." Rhona froze. Her heart skipped a beat. A band of outlaws. She'd heard rumors, tales of vicious men who roamed the countryside, preying on the weak and taking whatever they wanted, often with violence. Fear gripped her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. There was no time to panic. She slowly straightened, her hand moving instinctively toward the small knife she kept tucked into her belt. But before she could reach it, a rough hand seized her arm from behind. She gasped, trying to pull away, but the grip was too strong. Another figure emerged from the brush, a hulking man with a scar across his face, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You're coming with us," he growled, yanking her toward the tree line. Rhona's pulse quickened, but she fought to remain steady. There was no telling what these men would do to her. She had to think fast. She kicked her leg back, catching the man who held her in the shin, causing him to stumble. In that brief moment of surprise, she wrenched her arm free and ran, sprinting toward the barn in the distance. She didn't get far. One of the other men, a leaner figure dressed in a dark cloak, dashed in front of her, blocking her path. He grabbed her by the wrist and jerked her to a halt, spinning her around to face him. "No use running, lady," he sneered, his breath sour with the stench of alcohol. "You're not going anywhere." Rhona's heart raced, and for a split second, she felt the urge to fight back. But she knew that this was not a battle she could win with force alone. The outlaws were bigger, stronger, and outnumbered her. She needed to think quickly. One of the men, a burly figure with a broad chest and a twisted smile, stepped forward, his hands outstretched. "Let's make this easy on ourselves. We'll take you to our camp, and you'll stay there, nice and quiet. Maybe we'll get something out of it." Rhona didn't answer. Her mind was already working, searching for a way out, but all she could do was take in the situation around her. The dense woods on one side, the barn on the other, and the trio of men circling her like wolves. She couldn't escape them on foot, but she was no ordinary woman. The last thing the outlaws knew, the last thing they ever expected, was that Rhona, the quiet farmer's wife, was not as helpless as they believed. With a swift motion, she drew her small knife and slashed at the air, forcing the man holding her to step back. For a moment, the men hesitated, taken aback by her sudden resolve. She didn't have much, but she had the advantage of surprise, and she knew that they wouldn't be expecting the next move. In an instant, she reached into her coat, pulling out a small bundle tied with a leather strap. Before any of the men could react, she untied the bundle with practiced speed, revealing a small but deadly object, the sleek, polished handle of her longbow. The men's eyes widened in disbelief. "Wait," one of them began, but it was too late. With the practiced ease of someone who had spent years honing her craft, Rhona strung the bow in one fluid motion. The arrows were already within arm's reach, hidden in a quiver strapped to her back. She knocked one quickly, her eyes sharp and focused as she aimed directly at the leader, who was still stunned by her swift actions. The outlaws hesitated, caught off guard by the sudden shift in power. They had expected an easy target, a woman too frightened to defend herself. They were wrong. The leader, realizing his mistake, raised his hands in a futile gesture of surrender, but it was too late. Rhona's arrow shot through the air like lightning, striking the tree just inches away from his head with a satisfying thud. "Make one more move," she said coldly, her voice steady, "and I won't miss." The men froze, their eyes wide with disbelief. But before they could make another attempt to capture her, she was already on the move. Rhona spun quickly, her bow drawn and aimed at the man closest to her, her grip steady as she released the arrow. It struck him in the shoulder, sending him reeling back in pain, his weapon falling to the ground. The third man, who had been standing by in shock, stepped back slowly, eyes darting around as if he were weighing his options. But he knew. They all knew. They were not prepared for the most feared archer in the kingdom. "I suggest you leave," Rhona said, her voice low and deadly. "While you still can." The men exchanged a quick glance, their eyes flicking nervously to their fallen comrade. One by one, they began to back away, realizing that this was not a fight they could win. Their plan had been simple: capture the farmer's wife, take her for ransom. They had never once considered that the woman they were taking might be more than they could handle. With a final look at Rhona, the three outlaws turned and fled into the woods, their footfalls fading as they vanished into the night. Rhona stood there for a moment, still gripping her bow, her heart pounding in her chest. She had done it. She had protected herself. She had fought back. But as the last echo of the outlaws' retreating footsteps disappeared into the night, Rhona lowered her bow and allowed herself a brief sigh of relief. She had survived, just as she always had. But this would not be the last time she would be tested. Rhona stood alone in the fading light of the evening, her pulse still racing from the sudden confrontation. The outlaws were gone, their retreating footsteps a fading echo in the woods. But the tension in the air lingered, thick as smoke. She carefully lowered her bow and stepped over the fallen arrows, her heart still pounding in her chest, each breath heavy with the adrenaline of the fight. Her hands were steady, the knife still clutched in her other hand. But her mind was already turning, thinking ahead. They would return. She knew that much. No one who made the mistake of underestimating her would simply leave the matter be. The outlaws had come for a ransom, and they hadn't just been disarmed. They had been humiliated. No, they would come back with more men, and she had to be ready. With a determined look on her face, Rhona took a moment to scan the area, ensuring the forest around her was still quiet, still undisturbed. The woods were vast, but she knew them well. She had spent most of her life here, hunting, learning the patterns of the animals, finding the quiet spots where danger could be avoided or confronted. And now, more than ever, those lessons were needed. She glanced back toward the house. Her husband, Alaric, had been inside when the outlaws first arrived. He would have heard the commotion by now, but he didn't know what she had done, what she had just survived. She could only imagine the worry that would be etched on his face when he saw her. Alaric was a simple man, strong, kind-hearted, but not a warrior. He had always protected her in his way, but she had never asked him to fight her battles. He had no idea what she was truly capable of. She forced herself to look away from the house. Alaric's safety was her top priority now. The outlaws would be back, and they would target him next. Rhona set off toward the barn, her thoughts sharpening with every step. She needed to fortify their defenses, prepare for the inevitable. The arrows, the bow, the knife. She had those already, but there were other preparations to make. Traps, concealments, anything that could slow the outlaws down long enough for her to escape or fight back. As she reached the barn, Rhona's mind shifted, focusing on the next task. She was quick and methodical, moving silently but with purpose. She grabbed some extra arrows from the small hidden chest she kept near the wall. She tested the bow string to ensure it hadn't been damaged during the confrontation, her sharp eyes catching the smallest detail. It had been a close call. Too close. She could still feel the rush of fear in her gut, the kind that came only from being caught by surprise. Her eyes flicked to the horizon, to the dense trees and the creeping shadows as night fell. There was little time. Rhona moved swiftly to the back of the barn, where a small cellar door creaked open with a whisper of old wood. Inside, she retrieved a hidden pouch of salt, a fire starter, and other basic tools that would allow her to make a hasty escape should the outlaws come again. But she knew this wouldn't be enough to outrun them. The time for hiding was over. Her thoughts raced as she worked, a feeling of unease creeping over her. There was no telling when the outlaws would return or how many of them there would be. They would likely be furious, intent on taking her captive again, this time with more force. And Rhona knew they would try to break her, to make an example of her. The terror of what they could do to her, to Alaric, gnawed at her insides. But in that same breath, she also knew she couldn't let that happen. She wouldn't let that happen. By the time the night had settled fully into darkness, Rhona was ready. She had set her traps, hidden herself in the shadows, and armed herself with the tools necessary to defend their home. She stood quietly at the edge of the woods, the familiar sounds of the forest now replaced with the ominous stillness of waiting. The wind had died down, and the night was thick with the scent of earth and pine. The sound of footsteps broke the silence. Rhona's heart skipped, her body tensed, her fingers wrapping around her bow once more. She was ready. She had to be. She couldn't afford to hesitate now. The first figure emerged from the tree line, followed by others. They moved quietly at first, as though they were trying to approach unnoticed, but Rhona was already well aware of their presence. She could hear their whispered voices, the way they moved, heavy, clumsy. The men hadn't learned. They hadn't understood her strength. One of the men laughed under his breath, low and vicious. "That woman's got spirit, but she won't last long out here in the woods. I told you we shouldn't have left her alive," another voice muttered. "She's trouble." Rhona smiled to herself, a quiet, dangerous smile. They were still too confident, still too certain they could take her. But they didn't know the half of it. They didn't know the terror she could bring. The outlaws might have underestimated her before, but they wouldn't make the same mistake twice. She was prepared now, ready for whatever they would throw at her. The leader of the gang stepped forward, his hand gripping the hilt of a sword, his eyes scanning the woods. "There she is," he said, his voice loud enough for the others to hear. "You'll regret this, woman. You've made a mistake." Rhona stepped out from the trees, her bow drawn. The arrow knocked and aimed at the leader's chest. Her eyes were focused, unwavering. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of fear. She wouldn't make it easy for them. "No," she said, her voice calm and controlled, but carrying a deadly edge. "You made the mistake of underestimating me." The men froze, their eyes darting to one another. They had underestimated her once, and now they were about to pay for it. The leader of the outlaws, a man with a thick beard and a cruel sneer, stood frozen for a brief moment, clearly surprised by Rhona's calm and unyielding stance. His eyes locked with hers, but he didn't move a muscle. The other men behind him fidgeted nervously, shifting their weight and glancing around, unsure of how to proceed. The woman who had once seemed so helpless, so easily captured, was now a deadly threat. "You think you can stop us with a bow and arrow?" The leader finally sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance, though his hands twitched as if readying himself for a fight. "You're just a farmer's wife." Rhona's lips curled into a faint smile, though her eyes remained cold and focused. "I'm much more than that," she said, her voice as sharp as the arrow she held ready. She didn't flinch as the leader took a step toward her, his hand reaching for the hilt of his sword. She could see the way his eyes flicked to his comrades, signaling them to move in closer, but she was already several steps ahead of them. In the blink of an eye, the bowstring twanged, and the first arrow flew, striking the man directly in the leg with a sickening thud. He stumbled back with a howl of pain, his sword falling to the ground as he clutched his wounded leg. The others froze in shock, their eyes wide with disbelief. The leader was down, bleeding and helpless. Rhona didn't give them a chance to regroup. She pulled another arrow from her quiver, knocking it and firing it within seconds. This time, it found its mark in the shoulder of one of the other outlaws, a wiry man who had tried to sneak around her, thinking she hadn't seen him. He fell with a gasp, the arrow embedded deep in his arm, knocking him off his feet and causing him to writhe in pain. The remaining 2 men exchanged frantic looks. They had underestimated her from the start, just like the first. The woman they thought was weak was now more dangerous than any of them had imagined. They had no experience facing someone like Rhona, who had spent years honing her skills with a bow. The fear that began to rise in their eyes was palpable. They didn't know how to fight someone who was so calm, so precise in her movements. "Run!" one of the men shouted, his voice high-pitched with panic as he turned to flee, scrambling back into the woods. Rhona didn't hesitate. She let him go, her focus shifting to the last remaining outlaw, the leader who was still clutching his bleeding leg and cursing under his breath. The man had tried to fight back, thinking he could overpower her, but now he was reduced to a wounded mess, desperate to survive. But Rhona wasn't interested in mercy. She took a step closer, her eyes cold as ice. "You made a mistake coming here," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of everything she had endured in her life, the pain, the loss, and the strength she had gained over the years. The leader looked up at her, his face contorted with fear and frustration, but he didn't speak. He knew he was outmatched. The other men had fled, and now it was just the 2 of them. He was completely at her mercy. "Please," he whimpered, his voice weak. "I was just following orders. I don't want to die." Rhona stared at him for a long moment, her bow still drawn and aimed at his heart. Her hand was steady, her finger on the string, ready to release. But something inside her hesitated. He wasn't the first man she had faced down, but for some reason, this moment felt different. She had killed before, when she had to, but this was no ordinary fight. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about something deeper, something that had been building inside her since the day she had been forced to become a warrior. The man's eyes were wide with fear, but Rhona saw the truth in his plea. He wasn't the mastermind behind the attack. He was just a pawn in a much larger game, a tool used by someone more dangerous than he was. "You should have thought of that before you tried to take me," Rhona said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "But you're not the one I want." The leader looked confused, his brow furrowed in pain and disbelief. What do you mean?" Rhona's eyes narrowed, and for the briefest moment, she felt a flicker of pity for the man. But it was gone as quickly as it came. She lowered her bow, the arrow still aimed at him. "You won't be the last to try and cross me," she said, her voice as cold as the winter winds that swept through the forest. "But I won't be your victim, and you won't be anyone else's." With that, she stepped back, letting the man lie there in the dirt, bleeding and broken. He had no more value to her. He had made the mistake of underestimating her, and now he would pay the price. Rhona turned her back on him, walking toward the direction the others had fled. She could hear their footsteps receding, the sound of their retreating fear echoing through the forest. It wouldn't be long before they returned with reinforcements, but she would be ready. She would be ready for whatever came next. As she reached the edge of the forest and glanced back toward the house, Rhona knew the truth. The life she had known was gone. There was no going back to the quiet days of farming, of peaceful nights with Alaric. The world had changed, and so had she. And the next time the outlaws came for her, she would make sure they regretted it. The cold night air bit at Rhona's skin as she stepped back into the shadows of the woods, her eyes scanning the horizon. The outlaws had retreated, their desperate cries fading into the night. Rhona didn't feel relief. There was no time for that. They would regroup. They would return. And when they did, she would be ready for them. The forest was eerily quiet now, save for the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. It was the kind of silence that made her nerves tighten, made her senses sharpen even more. She knew this place better than anyone. Every tree, every stone, every patch of underbrush was part of her life, part of the way she had survived. She had been a hunter long before the outlaws came into her life, and she would remain one long after they were gone. Her thoughts turned to Alaric, and for a moment, a pang of guilt twisted in her chest. He had been safe, inside the house, unaware of what had happened, until now. Rhona couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth. Not yet. Not until she had a plan. Alaric was kind-hearted, but he was no fighter. He wouldn't be able to handle the weight of what she had just endured. She would protect him, just as she always had, even if that meant keeping the truth from him for a while longer. She reached the house in silence, slipping through the back door and quietly closing it behind her. The flickering light of the hearth cast long shadows on the walls, and there he was, Alaric, sitting by the fire, looking up at her with concern. His face, rugged from a day's work, softened as he saw her enter. "Rhona," he said, his voice thick with worry. "Where have you been?" "I heard shouting. I thought." His words trailed off as he saw the faint traces of dirt and blood on her hands, the bough slung over her back. "What's happened?" She didn't answer immediately. Her mind was racing, but she forced herself to steady her breathing. She couldn't let him see the fear, the exhaustion, the aftermath of what had happened. She had to hold it together. For him? "They came for me," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm of thoughts swirling inside her. "Outlaws. They tried to take me." Alaric stood up quickly, his face turning pale as his hands reached out toward her. "Gods, Rhona, are you hurt?" She shook her head, her lips pressed tightly together. "I'm fine, Alaric. I'm fine." She paused, looking away from him, her thoughts momentarily distant as the image of the men crawling back into the woods flashed in her mind. "But we can't stay here. Not anymore." "Stay?" Alaric asked, confusion and fear in his voice. "What do you mean? You're safe now, aren't you?" "I killed 2 of them," she said, her voice colder than she intended. "And the others will be back. They won't stop, Alaric. Not until they have me." He stood there for a moment, dumbfounded. His hand reached out, grasping hers. "Rhona, what are you talking about? You're not a fighter. You're a farmer's wife, not some warrior." Rhona took a deep breath, pulling herself out of the haze of emotions that had clouded her mind. She could see the worry in his eyes, but there was something else there too, something she didn't want to acknowledge. A part of him didn't believe her. He couldn't believe that the woman he had spent years with, the woman he had loved, could be capable of this kind of violence. "Alaric, I didn't ask for this," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet desperation. "But I won't let them take me. I won't let them take you. You have to trust me." He said nothing at first, just stared at her, his brow furrowing as the weight of her words settled in. Finally, his lips parted, his voice barely a whisper. "What do we do?" "I need to get us out of here," Rhona replied, her voice hardening as her resolve solidified. "We need to leave the farm. Find somewhere they won't be able to reach us. Somewhere safe." Alaric hesitated, glancing around the familiar room, his face pale. The farm, their home, had always been their sanctuary. But now, it was a place of danger. It wasn't safe anymore. "I'll pack our things," he said quietly, moving toward the small chest in the corner of the room. But Rhona stopped him. "No," she said, her voice commanding. "There's no time to waste. We leave now." She moved to the door and opened it, stepping into the night once more. Her bow was still in her hand, and the moonlight glinted off the fletching of the arrows she carried. The wood seemed to call to her, the wind rustling through the trees, whispering promises of safety or threats of danger. The path ahead was unclear, but she would lead them through it. No one was going to take her from this life, not without a fight. Alaric followed her into the night, his face filled with fear, but also something else, a flicker of understanding. Rhona was no longer the woman he had married. She wasn't just the quiet, gentle farmer's wife. She was someone else now, someone capable of far more than he could have ever imagined. As they walked into the woods, the silence between them was thick with unspoken words. Rhona's heart beat steadily, but in the back of her mind, she knew what was coming. She could hear the outlaws' footsteps in her head, their laughter, their jeers. They would come again, but this time, she would be ready. They wouldn't know what hit them. The cool night air hung thick with tension as Rhona and Alaric moved through the woods, the trees towering over them like silent sentinels. The sounds of the world around them, rustling leaves, the occasional call of a nightbird, seemed distant and muffled, as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Rhona kept her pace quick but controlled, her senses sharp. She could hear the faint crackling of twigs behind them, the soft snap of branches underfoot, and it only sharpened her awareness. Alaric's steps were slower, heavier with the weight of uncertainty. He had never been in this kind of danger before, never had to think on his feet like this. The gentle life they had built together seemed so far away now, as distant as the life they had once dreamed of. "Rhona," Alaric's voice broke the quiet, his tone hesitant. "What exactly are we running from?" Her eyes flicked over to him, but she didn't slow her pace. "Outlaws, Alaric. Men who won't stop until they get what they want. And they want me. They'll come for us. No matter where we go, they'll come." Alaric swallowed hard. He had never imagined that their peaceful existence, working the land, living off the bounty of the farm, would unravel so quickly. He couldn't even grasp the full extent of what had just happened. His mind raced, thoughts clouded by confusion, fear, and the growing understanding that he had underestimated his wife. "Are you saying you've been in fights before? That you've done this before?" The question hit Rhona like a stone in the chest, but she didn't falter in her stride. She had already made the decision to tell him the truth, but it would be harder now. Alaric had always thought her simple, content with a life on the farm. He didn't know that there was more to her. More to the woman who had once been trained in the art of war, in the deadly discipline of archery, in the ways of survival. The years spent in the fields, living a life of quiet contentment, had masked the shadow of her past. But it wasn't something she could hide from anymore. "Yes," Rhona replied evenly, her voice steady, though there was a hardness to it. "I've fought before. I've killed before." Alaric froze in his tracks, his breath caught in his throat, the weight of her words sinking in. He turned his face toward her, eyes wide with disbelief. "You've killed?" His voice was thick with confusion and fear, the reality of what she was saying finally starting to take hold. She met his gaze, her expression a mixture of sadness and resolve. "Not until I had to. But yes, I've done things. Things that weren't easy. Things I never wanted to do. But the world doesn't leave you with many choices when it comes to survival. I learned that a long time ago." The air between them thickened, and Rhona could sense the confusion gnawing at Alaric. His mind was still trying to make sense of the woman standing before him, the woman who had been his wife for years, the woman he thought he knew. But she was someone else now, someone forged by the flames of a brutal reality. He didn't know how to respond. He couldn't even begin to comprehend the depth of the world she had been part of before he met her. Her eyes, once soft and kind, had hardened over time, shaped by experiences he couldn't possibly understand. She had been a warrior before she was a wife, and now the veil had been lifted. "I never wanted you to know this part of me," Rhona said softly, her gaze dropping to the ground as they continued walking. "I wanted you to see me as the woman who tended the crops, who made your meals, who laughed with you over dinner. I never wanted you to see me as someone capable of violence." Alaric struggled to find the words. He had loved her for so long, loved the woman who had made his life feel whole, and now, he felt like a stranger in his own world. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice low. Rhona kept her eyes ahead, her movements sharp and purposeful as they neared the deeper parts of the forest. "You don't have to say anything, Alaric. You just have to stay with me. Keep moving." As they ventured deeper into the forest, the shadows grew longer, darker, and more ominous. Rhona's senses were on high alert. The outlaws wouldn't be far behind, and every step they took brought them closer to danger. But they couldn't stop. Not now. Alaric, still processing the weight of her revelations, followed her as best he could. He didn't know what would happen next, what their lives would look like now. The simple life they had once known was gone. And Rhona, his wife, the woman he had loved for so long, was someone he barely recognized. The forest soon opened up into a clearing, and Rhona paused, her gaze shifting to the horizon. The land was quiet, but she could feel the eyes of the outlaws on her, even from a distance. They were watching. They were waiting for the right moment to strike. She turned to Alaric. "This is it. We can't stay here. They'll be here any moment. I need you to stay close, Alaric. Do exactly what I say." He nodded, but there was hesitation in his eyes. He wanted to trust her, wanted to believe that they could still outrun the danger, but the truth was staring him in the face. They weren't safe. Not anymore. And in the silence of the woods, as the first stirrings of danger grew closer, Rhona felt the weight of her past settle over her like a cloak. She had fought once, long ago, for her life, for her survival, and she would do it again, with everything she had. For Alaric. For them. The night seemed to stretch on, and the first sound of footsteps in the distance reached her ears. The outlaws had arrived. The forest around Rhona and Alaric was quiet again, too quiet. The momentary peace had faded, replaced by the tense stillness that always preceded danger. Rhona's every sense was alert, her heart thudding in her chest as she scanned the darkened woods. The outlaws had been clever. They wouldn't just come charging in. They would circle. They would wait. And they would strike when she least expected it. Her hand tightened around her bow, her fingers running over the string, checking once more for tension. The bow, her constant companion for years, had become an extension of her own body, as natural as breathing. She could feel the weight of it, the power it gave her, the power she would need to protect herself and Alaric. "Stay close to me," Rhona whispered to Alaric, her voice low, urgent. His eyes were wide with fear, his face pale as he watched the forest around them. He had never been in this kind of danger, never had to think like a fighter, and it was clear in the way he moved, hesitant, unsure. She could see the fear in him, but there was no time for hesitation. Alaric nodded, his lips pressed together, his hands trembling slightly. He had seen the arrows fly before, but never like this. He had heard the stories of Rhona's skills, how she could take down a deer with a single shot, how her aim was unmatched. But he had never seen her in action like this, never understood the depth of what she was capable of. And now, faced with the looming threat of the outlaws, he was beginning to understand just how far she would go to protect him. The sounds of the forest seemed to grow louder in the silence, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of branches in the wind. And then, faintly, barely audible, came the sound Rhona had been dreading. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and unmistakably human. Her breath caught in her throat as the figures began to take shape through the trees. For men, creeping closer, their silhouettes barely visible in the dark. The leader, still limping from the arrow wound Rhona had given him, stood at the front. His expression was filled with fury and something else, fear. He knew now what kind of woman he was dealing with. "Stay low," Rhona muttered to Alaric, her voice barely a breath. Her eyes were trained on the men, watching their every move, reading their intentions. They were going to try again. They wouldn't stop until they had her. The leader barked an order to his men, and they split up, fanning out through the trees, trying to circle them. They were desperate now. This wasn't about just taking her anymore. This was personal. Rhona's attack had humiliated them, and they wouldn't rest until they had her under their control. She could hear them now, their movements soft but deliberate, like predators closing in on their prey. Rhona didn't panic. She had been in situations like this before. The key was to stay calm, stay focused. But there was one problem, Alaric. He wasn't a fighter, and he didn't have the instinct to know when to move, when to stay still. "Alaric," Rhona whispered urgently, turning to face him. "You have to hide. Get behind that tree. Stay low and don't make a sound." He hesitated for a moment, the fear in his eyes threatening to paralyze him. "What about you?" "I'll take care of them," she said, her voice steady, her expression hardening. "Do what I said. Now." Alaric nodded, though his movements were slow, filled with doubt. But he did as she asked, darting behind a large oak tree and crouching low, his breathing shallow. Rhona didn't have time to check on him again. She had to focus. She couldn't afford to be distracted. The leader and his men were closing in now. They didn't know where Rhona was, not yet, but they were getting closer. She could hear their low mutterings, their whispers growing louder as they tried to find her, as they moved through the thick underbrush. Rhona took a deep breath, feeling the familiar tension in her muscles as she prepared herself. She knew what she had to do. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about sending a message. She crouched low, slipping through the trees with the quiet grace of a predator. The men were distracted now, their attention divided as they searched for any sign of her. They were confident, too confident. They thought she was still in the open, trying to run. But Rhona knew how to move in the shadows. She had learned to blend into the forest, to become part of it. As one of the men stepped into a small clearing, his back to her, Rhona drew an arrow, knocking it quickly and silently. She took aim, her breath steady, her fingers pulling back the string with precision. The moment she released the arrow, it flew through the air with deadly accuracy, striking the man in the shoulder. He cried out in pain, staggering back, but it was too late for him. The arrow had already done its work. The others heard the cry and spun around, eyes wide with fear. They knew what she was capable of now, but it was already too late. Rhona was already moving again, her second arrow ready. She didn't wait for them to regroup. She didn't give them a chance to retaliate. The next man was too slow, his sword already half drawn when the arrow found its mark in his chest. He collapsed to the ground, his body twitching as he fell. The remaining two men scrambled to retreat, their faces filled with terror. They hadn't expected this, hadn't expected a fight like this. They had underestimated her, but they would learn. Rhona didn't give them the luxury of running. She moved quickly, silently, closing the distance between them. The leader was still at the edge of the clearing, his face pale, his breath shallow. He had no idea what to do. "Please," he begged, raising his hands in a futile gesture of surrender. "We don't have to do this. Just let us go, and we'll leave you in peace." Rhona stepped forward, her bow still drawn. She could see the fear in his eyes, but it didn't matter. He had made his choice when he crossed her path. "No," she said, her voice cold, filled with the steel of someone who had already made their own decision. "You made the mistake of coming here." She released the arrow, and it flew, striking the leader in the chest before he could move. He fell to the ground, his face filled with disbelief as he gasped for breath, the life draining from him. Rhona lowered her bow, her breath steady, her pulse still quick from the fight. The forest was silent again, but this time, it felt different. She had sent a message, one that the outlaws would not forget. She turned toward Alaric, who was still hiding behind the tree, his eyes wide as he watched her approach. His lips parted, but no words came out. The shock was evident in his expression, his disbelief at what he had just witnessed. "We need to go," Rhona said softly, her voice calm but firm. "We can't stay here. There's more coming." And without another word, they disappeared into the woods once again, their lives uncertain, but their resolve stronger than ever. Rhona knew that the outlaws would be back, more of them, angrier than before. But she was ready. She had fought for her life before, and she would fight for it again. This time, they would regret crossing paths with her. Rhona moved through the woods like a shadow, her senses heightened, her every step calculated. She knew the forest better than anyone, and the trees, the underbrush, the paths they followed. These were her allies now. Her bow was still clutched in her hand. Though her pace had slowed, her thoughts focused on the next steps. The outlaws had been defeated, for now, but they would return. She had no doubt about that. Alaric stumbled behind her, his footsteps heavy and uncertain. His face was pale, his gaze fixed on the ground, as though he still couldn't fully process what had happened. He had always known Rhona was strong, capable, but this was something else. He had never imagined his wife, his gentle, kind-hearted wife, could be capable of such fierce, cold precision. Rhona glanced over her shoulder, catching a glimpse of his tired expression. She knew he was struggling to keep up, but there was little time for rest. They had to move. "Alaric," she said softly, her voice carrying through the stillness of the woods, "we can't stop yet. We need to get farther away from the farm. The outlaws will come back. They won't stop until they have what they want." Alaric didn't respond at first. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their truth. Rhona knew how hard it must be for him to accept this new reality. The life they had built, their quiet existence on the farm, was now a distant memory. Their world had shifted, and there was no going back. "Where do we go?" he asked finally, his voice cracked with exhaustion. Rhona hesitated. She had no perfect answer, no clear path laid out before them. But she knew one thing for sure. The farther they got from the farm, the better their chances of survival. They needed to reach the next town, or better yet, a safe haven. A place where she could regroup, where they could stay hidden. "We head east," she replied, her voice firm with determination. "There's a village up ahead, a few days' walk. We can find shelter there. But we need to keep moving. Fast." Alaric nodded, though the look in his eyes betrayed his doubts. He wasn't sure what to believe anymore. One moment, his world had been simple, manageable. He had been content. And now? Now, the woman he loved had turned into someone entirely different. She wasn't just his wife. She was a warrior, a force to be reckoned with, and that thought terrified him. Still, Rhona didn't wait for him to say anything more. She pressed forward, her every movement fluid, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The darkness of the forest closed in around them, but she felt no fear. This was her element. The quiet, the stillness, the anticipation of danger that never seemed to end. Alaric struggled to keep pace, but his legs were sore, his feet aching from the unexpected journey. He had never been much of a traveler. He was a farmer, after all. His hands were made for the plow, not the sword. But now, they were both part of a much bigger story, one they hadn't chosen. The sound of hooves in the distance caused Rhona to pause. She lifted a hand to signal Alaric to stop, her body going completely still. They both crouched low, hiding in the thick underbrush just beyond the main path. The sound of the hooves grew louder, and she instinctively reached for an arrow, knocking it and drawing her bow as the horses came into view. Two riders appeared on the path, their figures silhouetted against the dimming sky. Rhona's sharp eyes immediately assessed the situation. They weren't outlaws. They were men in armor, carrying swords, likely soldiers. But that didn't mean they were safe. The riders slowed as they passed, and Rhona's grip on her bow tightened. She couldn't risk them noticing them, couldn't afford to be seen. She waited, barely breathing, as they drew closer. The soldiers were deep in conversation, their voices muffled by the distance. One of them laughed, a harsh, grating sound, but neither man seemed to be paying attention to the surrounding woods. They passed by without giving any indication they had noticed anything unusual. Rhona held her breath as they disappeared into the distance, their voices trailing off. Only when she was certain they were gone did she lower her bow. She exhaled slowly, her eyes meeting Alaric's. "Soldiers," she said quietly, her voice calm but filled with a sense of urgency. "We need to move now." Alaric nodded, his brow furrowed with confusion. "Are they going to stop us?" Rhona shook her head. "I don't know, but we can't afford to take that chance. We have to keep going." They continued their journey, though at a much faster pace now. Every step they took, Rhona's mind raced. She knew the outlaws were still after her. But what if they weren't just after her anymore? What if the soldiers were part of a larger problem? Something even more dangerous than the thugs in the woods? As the hours passed, the trees began to thin, and the landscape slowly began to change. The familiar sounds of the forest were replaced with the soft hum of the wind, the distant calls of animals in the grasslands, and the steady rhythm of their footsteps. The moon was high in the sky now, casting a pale glow over everything. Rhona could feel her body growing tired, the exhaustion of the night's events beginning to take hold. But she didn't stop. She couldn't afford to. The men who had attacked her earlier were just the beginning. She didn't know who was behind it all, but the outlaws were merely pawns in a much bigger game. And she had just become a part of that game, for better or worse. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, the exhaustion was starting to take its toll on both of them. Alaric's movements were slower now, his breath labored. Rhona turned to him, her expression softening. "Do you need to rest?" she asked, though her voice was filled with the urgency of the situation. Alaric shook his head. "I'm fine. I don't know what's going to happen. We can't keep running, can we?" Rhona didn't answer right away. She didn't have a clear answer. She didn't know how to fix the world they had fallen into. But she did know one thing. They wouldn't survive if they kept running forever. They needed answers. They needed to find out who was behind the outlaws' attacks and why they had come for her. "We won't run forever, Alaric," she said finally, her voice filled with resolve. But we have to be smart. And we need to keep moving until we're ready to fight back. And so, they pressed on, deeper into the unknown, their fates entwined in a story much bigger than they had ever anticipated. Rhona's eyes scanned the horizon as they moved farther from the safety of the forest. The world outside the trees felt foreign, wide open, exposed. The sense of isolation was palpable, the cold of the night wrapping around them as they trudged forward. The journey had taken its toll on them both. Rhona's mind raced with worry, but her body had adapted to the strain, each muscle and tendon moving with purpose, no longer distracted by fatigue. But Alaric was struggling. His steps had grown slower, heavier, as the miles stretched behind them. Rhona could see it in his face. The weight of their situation had finally caught up to him, but still, he didn't complain. He kept moving forward, driven by the same sense of survival that had kicked in when they first fled their home. "Do you think they'll come for us?" Alaric's voice broke the silence, quiet and full of uncertainty. "The Outlaws, I mean?" Rhona didn't answer right away. She didn't have the heart to tell him what she knew, that they would come, that it wasn't just the Outlaws they had to worry about anymore. The soldiers, the way they had been patrolling the area, the way they'd seemed to be searching for someone, maybe for her. "They'll come," Rhona said finally, her voice grim. "But we have to keep moving. They won't stop. The Outlaws are part of something much bigger." Alaric stopped for a moment, his eyes filled with the unspoken question. What did that mean? What were they really running from? Rhona knew he wanted answers. She wanted them too, but there was no time to explain. She could feel the urgency growing inside her. She could feel the shift in the air, the feeling that they were being hunted. "There's a village up ahead," she continued, her tone resolute. "It's hidden. Few know about it. We can find shelter there, and maybe answers." Alaric nodded, though doubt lingered in his eyes. He trusted Rhona, but the uncertainty of everything that had happened in the last few days was eating away at him. They had been forced to flee, and now they were heading toward an unknown village with no guarantees. "But what if it's not safe?" he asked, his voice strained. Rhona didn't turn back to him, but her jaw tightened. "We don't have a choice." The village had been a place of refuge once, a small community hidden deep in the woods, untouched by the chaos that had consumed the rest of the kingdom. She had passed through it once, years ago, on a mission to gather supplies. The people there had no interest in the kingdom's politics. They were self-sufficient, isolated, and for that reason, Rhona knew it was their best option. They walked in silence for hours, the distance between them and the Outlaws slowly growing. But as the night wore on, a sense of unease settled in her stomach. The path seemed longer than she remembered, more treacherous, and the quiet was oppressive, almost unnatural. Just as the moon reached its zenith, casting a pale, silvery light over the land, they saw it. A flicker of light in the distance. It was a soft glow, a warm flicker that seemed so out of place in the cold night air. "There," Rhona said, her voice steady as she gestured ahead. "That's the village." They quickened their pace, the sounds of their footsteps the only noise in the otherwise still world. As they neared the village's edge, the landscape began to change. The dense woods gave way to a clearing, and the village revealed itself like a hidden gem, tucked away from the world's prying eyes. Small, thatched houses lined the edge of a meandering stream, and the flickering lights came from lanterns hanging from posts along the village's narrow roads. The place was quiet, almost too quiet. Rhona's instincts kicked in. She had always trusted her gut, and something about the scene in front of her felt off. It was too still, too unwelcoming. She stopped just at the edge of the village, her hand reaching for Alaric's arm. "Wait here." Alaric looked at her in confusion. "What do you mean? You said it was safe." Rhona glanced back at him, her eyes hard. "I'll go first. Stay hidden. If anything happens, you run. Understand?" Alaric opened his mouth to protest, but Rhona held up her hand. He didn't argue. He just nodded. She moved forward, her steps light, her senses alert. The villagers had always been wary of outsiders, and Rhona knew that they would not welcome strangers with open arms. She had no illusions that this would be an easy entrance, but right now, it was their best hope. As she approached the first house, She saw the dim outline of a figure standing near the door. The man's face was hidden in shadow, but his posture was alert, his eyes scanning the perimeter as if waiting for something. Rhona approached cautiously, her hand still gripping her bow, though she didn't pull an arrow. The man's eyes locked onto her as she drew closer, and for a moment, she saw his posture stiffen. But then, something in his expression softened. "Not many come here," the man said, his voice low but not unfriendly. "What's your business?" Rhona didn't hesitate. "I'm looking for shelter. We've been followed. I'm not sure if we're safe out here." The man studied her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as he seemed to weigh her words. His gaze flicked past her, and for a fleeting second, Rhona thought she saw something flash in his eyes. A recognition, maybe? But it was gone before she could be sure. "Follow me," he said finally, stepping aside to allow her into the village. She moved quickly, keeping her bow ready but concealed under her cloak. Alaric followed her in the distance, staying out of sight, just as she had instructed him. As they passed a few more houses, Rhona noticed that the village was not as quiet as it had first seemed. There were people awake, men and women, their faces tired but alert, standing outside their homes, watching them closely. Their eyes were filled with suspicion, but Rhona was accustomed to that look. It was the same one she'd gotten from strangers who didn't trust outsiders. The man led her to a small, nondescript house at the far edge of the village, where a few lanterns hung from the rafters. He knocked on the door 3 times before it opened, revealing a woman with graying hair and a face that looked as though it had seen too many hard years. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but we need help," the man said. The woman's eyes darted to Rhona and then to Alaric, who had finally emerged from the shadows. She studied them for a moment, her gaze calculating. "We don't take kindly to strangers," she said, her voice gravelly but not unkind. "But you've made it this far. What do you want?" Rhona's heart raced as she met the woman's gaze, feeling the weight of her words. They weren't just asking for shelter. They were asking for their lives. "We need protection," Rhona said. "The outlaws will be back, and if they find us—" The woman nodded, stepping aside. "Come in. You're safe here, for now. But don't trust anyone." Rhona's breath caught in her throat. Safe for now. But nothing was ever truly safe anymore. Rhona and Alaric stepped cautiously into the small house, the door creaking shut behind them. Inside, the warmth of a fire greeted them, the flickering light casting long shadows across the stone walls. The woman who had let them in motioned for them to sit by the hearth, her sharp eyes never leaving them. "Warm yourselves," she said, her tone matter-of-fact, yet tinged with something like concern. "But keep quiet. People here don't trust outsiders." Rhona nodded, her gaze scanning the room. The house was sparse but functional. A table set with simple dishes, shelves stocked with dried herbs, and a few sleeping mats rolled up neatly on the floor. It looked like a place used to quiet solitude, untouched by the outside world. And yet, something felt off. The villagers might have been secluded, but there was an air of readiness here, an underlying tension that couldn't be ignored. Alaric sat down near the fire, rubbing his hands together to warm them. His exhaustion was evident now, his body weighed down by the long journey and the constant fear that clung to them both. Rhona stood for a moment, her senses still sharp, before she finally sat down beside him. The woman who had let them in took a seat across from them, watching them carefully. "Name's Gilda," she said. "What brings you here?" Rhona glanced at Alaric, who was still silent, his eyes flicking nervously around the room. She could see the worry etched on his face. He hadn't fully grasped the danger they were in, and Rhona knew it was her job to shield him from the worst of it. But the time for shelter was over. The outlaws would be back, and not just them. The village itself might be in danger if it was caught in the crossfire. "We're running from outlaws," Rhona said, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "They came for me. They'll come for us again. And we need a place to hide." Gilda's eyes softened just slightly. "Outlaws," she repeated, almost to herself. "You're not the first to come to our doorstep looking for refuge." Her voice dropped to a low whisper. "And I doubt you'll be the last." Rhona's gaze sharpened, the words striking her like a slap. "What do you mean?" Gilda glanced toward the door, as if making sure no one was listening. Then she leaned forward, her voice lowered to a near whisper. This village is a sanctuary, yes, but it's also a place of secrets. Not just the outlaws you've crossed paths with. There's something more. Something darker. The kingdom's troubles. They run deeper than you know. Rhona's heart skipped a beat. What are you talking about? There are forces at play here, Gilda said slowly, her eyes glinting with something unreadable. And they're not just after your bow and your life. They're after everyone who stands in the way of their goals. We've seen the signs. The soldiers, the outlaws, they're all connected to something bigger. And they're coming for everyone, not just the ones they've marked. Rhona's hand instinctively went to her bow, still slung across her back. She didn't trust Gilda, but there was something in her words that rang true. Everything felt off. The outlaws, the soldiers, the kingdom itself. It was all part of a larger web of chaos that they were now trapped in. Alaric shifted uncomfortably. What kind of trouble are we talking about? Gilda's gaze hardened, and for a moment, Rhona saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, something she hadn't expected from someone so composed. I don't know exactly, Gilda replied, her voice quieter now, but I've seen the way they've been moving. The outlaws, the soldiers, they're being used. By someone. Who? Rhona demanded, leaning forward. Gilda hesitated, clearly weighing whether or not to tell them the full truth. But there was no turning back now. Rhona could see it in her eyes. This was a woman who had been living with secrets for too long, secrets that were now spilling over. She had no choice but to trust Rhona. There's a power behind all this, Gilda said finally, her voice barely a whisper. A faction that's been working in the shadows. They've infiltrated the kingdom, and they're using the chaos, the outlaws, the soldiers, to break it apart from within. They're after control. They're after the throne. Rhona's heart skipped in her chest. The throne? Her mind reeled as the enormity of the words settled over her. A rebellion. A faction of hidden enemies trying to tear the kingdom apart. And here they were, caught right in the middle of it. Do you have any idea who they are? Alaric's voice broke the silence, his face pale with disbelief. Who's behind it? Gilda's face darkened, and she shook her head. I don't know, but I've seen enough to know they're dangerous. And they won't stop until they get what they want. The silence in the room grew heavy, pressing down on them like a weight. Rhona could feel the walls closing in. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This wasn't just about her and Alaric running from a handful of outlaws. This was something far bigger. They were caught in the storm of a kingdom's unraveling, and they didn't know how to escape. Rhona stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. What do we do now? Gilda's eyes met hers, filled with a mix of caution and a glimmer of hope. We stay hidden. For now. But you'll need more than a bow if you're going to survive this. You'll need allies. Rhona's breath caught. She had thought about this, of course. She had known the outlaws were a mere part of the bigger picture, but allies, true allies, were a rare thing. Trust was a fragile thing, and she had learned long ago that betrayal was often closer than it appeared. Where can we find them? Rhona asked, her voice resolute. These allies. Gilda's expression shifted, a wry smile tugging at the corner of her lips. That's the trick, isn't it? Finding them. You'll need to look beyond this village. There are others like me, hidden, waiting for the right moment to act. But you'll have to earn their trust, just as I've earned mine. And how do we do that? Alaric asked, his voice still tinged with uncertainty. You begin by proving you can survive, Gilda replied simply. And you survive by staying hidden. For now, that's all you can do. Rhona nodded, her resolve hardening. This was far from over. The kingdom was falling apart, and she wasn't about to stand idly by and watch it crumble. They would fight, and they would do it on their terms. But the road ahead was long and dangerous, and Rhona was ready. The fire crackled softly in the corner of the room, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls as Rhona sat near the hearth, her thoughts swirling like the smoke rising from the flames. Alaric sat beside her, his shoulders slumped, his face drawn with exhaustion. The tension between them was thick, but neither of them spoke. They both understood that words could not solve the mess they found themselves in. The village had been quiet since their arrival, and the stillness was starting to weigh on Rhona's mind. Gilda had made it clear that staying hidden was their only option, for now. But Rhona wasn't sure how long she could keep Alaric in the dark. The truth about what they were up against, about the rebellion, the outlaws, the hidden faction, was more than he could possibly understand right now. The fire popped, a soft hiss filling the silence. Rhona's eyes flicked to the flames, and she wondered just how long they could keep running. She had lived her life in shadows, always on the move, always prepared for the worst. But now, it felt different. She had more to protect. Alaric, the life they had built. She had to fight to preserve it. She couldn't keep hiding. Alaric stirred beside her, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "What's the plan?" he asked quietly, his eyes uncertain. "How long do we stay here?" Rhona looked at him, seeing the strain in his face. He had never wanted any of this. He had always been content with the life they had carved out on the farm. But now, that life was gone, and he didn't know how to move forward in this new world. A world where survival meant constantly looking over your shoulder. "I don't know," Rhona replied honestly, her voice steady despite the uncertainty that gnawed at her. "Gilda says we need to wait. Stay hidden for now. But I don't trust anyone here completely. We need to find out more. Who is behind this rebellion? What do they want with me? And how do we stop them?" Alaric's gaze dropped to his hands, his fingers rubbing the rough fabric of his tunic. "I don't understand it, Rhona. This isn't our fight. We didn't ask for any of this." "I know," she said softly. "I never asked for it either. But sometimes, life makes decisions for you. And now we're caught in the middle of something much bigger than us." Alaric's eyes flicked up to meet hers, and for a moment, Rhona saw the fear in them. The same fear she felt, buried deep beneath the surface. They had always faced their challenges together. But this was something neither of them had been prepared for. Before either of them could say anything else, the door to the small house creaked open. Gilda stood in the doorway, her face shadowed, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk," she said simply. Rhona stood, her muscles tense, ready for whatever news Gilda had to offer. Alaric hesitated but stood beside her, his hand finding hers as if seeking reassurance. "What is it?" Rhona asked, her voice sharp. Gilda's eyes flicked between them, taking in their wary expressions. She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her, casting them both in the dim light. "More of them are coming," Gilda said quietly. "The outlaws, the soldiers, they're starting to get closer. The faction that's behind all this, they have eyes everywhere. They've been watching." Rhona's heart skipped a beat. "How do you know this?" Gilda's face was grim as she crossed the room and took a seat at the table. "I've been hearing whispers. There are others like me, people who have been watching the movement from the shadows. There's a meeting tonight. If you're going to learn anything about the faction behind all of this, tonight might be your only chance." Rhona exchanged a look with Alaric. He didn't speak, but she could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He was still processing everything. The outlaws, the soldiers, the hidden faction that was pulling the strings of the kingdom. He didn't understand the danger they were in, but Rhona had seen enough to know they couldn't afford to waste time. "We go," Rhona said firmly, her decision made in that instant. Gilda raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her response. "You sure? It's not safe. Not for you. Not for anyone." "I'm not afraid of them," Rhona replied, her voice low but filled with an icy resolve. "I need to know who's behind this. If they want me, if they want us, then I want to know why. We can't keep running forever." Gilda studied her for a long moment, as if measuring the weight of her words. Finally, she nodded. "Fine," she said, "but you need to be careful. The people you'll meet tonight, they're not all allies. They'll test you, and if you're not careful, you'll end up in deeper trouble than you've already found yourselves in." Rhona's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening as she realized the truth of Gilda's words. Trust wasn't something she gave lightly. She knew that the faction they were up against was dangerous, and if they didn't navigate this carefully, it could be their last move. "We'll be careful," Rhona promised, "but we have no choice. We need to know what's coming." Gilda nodded again, a small flicker of approval in her eyes. "I'll get you there. But once we leave, you'll have to make your own choices. And be ready for anything." Rhona took a deep breath, steadying herself. The road ahead was unclear, filled with danger and uncertainty, but she knew one thing for sure. She was done running. The outlaws, the soldiers, the hidden faction. They had made one mistake by underestimating her. They wouldn't make it again. "Let's go," Rhona said, her voice firm. With that, Gilda led them out of the house and into the night, toward the meeting that would change everything. The village, the people who hid there, the outlaws chasing them. It was all a part of a larger game, and Rhona was about to learn just how deep the rabbit hole went. The night air was cold and biting as Rhona, Alaric, and Gilda made their way through the winding streets of the village. The houses around them stood like silent sentinels, their windows dark, and the only sounds that accompanied them were the distant chirps of night creatures and the rustling of leaves in the wind. The quiet of the village had shifted, now replaced by a sense of urgency and tension, as though the entire place was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Gilda led them down a narrow path that cut through the village's outer perimeter, avoiding the main roads. Her steps were deliberate, her head down, as if she were accustomed to moving in secrecy. Rhona kept pace, her eyes darting to every shadow, every movement in the corners of her vision. Alaric, trailing just behind, seemed increasingly nervous, the unfamiliarity of their situation settling deeper in his chest. But Rhona's determination was unshaken. There was no turning back now. They were already too far into this. Eventually, they reached the edge of the village, where a small, secluded building stood, half hidden by the thick trees surrounding it. It was nothing more than a modest structure, barely more than a shack, but the air around it felt different. Rhona could sense the tension in the air as they approached it. This place was important. It was more than just a safe house. It was a hub of secrets. "This is where we meet them," Gilda said, her voice low but filled with purpose. "Stay close and don't speak unless you have to." Rhona nodded, her fingers tightening around her bow as she stepped inside, Alaric following closely behind. The door creaked open with a groan, and they were immediately hit by the warm scent of incense and the heavy atmosphere of the room. The flickering light of candles illuminated the figures gathered around a large table in the center, their faces shadowed by hoods and the dim light. At the far end of the table sat a man whose presence was undeniable. He was tall, with a strong frame and piercing eyes that seemed to see through everything. His face was partially hidden beneath a hood, but there was no mistaking the aura of power and control that emanated from him. "Ah, Gilda," the man said, his voice smooth and commanding. "You brought guests." His eyes flicked briefly to Rhona and Alaric, sizing them up with a casual glance. "I see you've decided to trust them." Gilda nodded but didn't speak. Rhona stepped forward, her posture straight, her gaze locked onto the man. "I'm Rhona," she said, her voice steady, though she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "We're here for answers. We need to know what's going on and why we're being hunted." The man's lips twitched into a smile, though it wasn't one of warmth. "Answers? You're bold. I'll give you that. But you're also asking questions that not many are ready to hear." The room fell silent for a moment, and Rhona felt the tension rise, her instincts screaming that she was stepping into dangerous territory. The man watched her closely, his eyes never leaving her face. "Do you think you can just waltz in here, demand answers, and walk away?" he continued, his voice low and almost amused. "You're not the first to seek us out, but I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation you're in." Rhona didn't flinch. She had faced down far worse, and this was no different. "Then explain it to me," she said, her voice calm but insistent. "Explain why the kingdom is falling apart, why the outlaws are hunting me, and why there's a faction trying to tear everything down." The man's expression shifted, becoming more serious. "You're right about one thing," he said, his tone now colder. "The kingdom is falling apart. But what you don't know is that it's not just because of some outlaws or some petty squabbles over land. There's something far darker at play." Rhona leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" The man's gaze flicked briefly to the people around the table, and then back to her. "There's a power rising in the shadows. A faction that has been pulling the strings for years, quietly working behind the scenes. The outlaws you've encountered? They're just pawns in a much larger game. Rhona felt her heart race, the words sinking in like a stone. The world she had known, the simple life she had once shared with Alaric, was slipping further away, replaced by something far more dangerous. "And what do you want from us?" she asked, her voice cutting through the silence. "Why involve us in your game?" The man chuckled softly, a dark, humorless sound. "You're not here by accident, Rhona. You've been chosen. You have something they want, something they need. What could I possibly have that they want?" Rhona asked, her voice incredulous, but her heart pounding. The man's smile returned, but it was colder this time. "You're not just a farmer's wife, Rhona. You're much more than that. You've been trained. You've been made into something far more dangerous than you realize. And they want to use that." Rhona's mind raced as she processed his words. They had been watching her, tracking her, long before the outlaws ever came to her farm. She had always known she wasn't just a simple farmer's wife. But this was beyond what she could have ever imagined. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice steady but full of defiance. The man's expression didn't change. "You won't have a choice. None of us do. We're all playing our parts in this. The outlaws, the soldiers, the faction. They'll stop at nothing to see their plan succeed." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a suffocating fog. Rhona felt a surge of anger rise in her chest, but she kept it contained. She had always hated being manipulated, being a pawn in someone else's game. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice tight with barely contained frustration. The man leaned back in his chair, his gaze calculating. "First, you prove you can survive. Then, we'll see what you're truly capable of." Rhona felt her stomach tighten. The situation was spiraling out of control, and there was no turning back now. She had walked into a den of wolves, and the only way out was to play the game. The air inside the small building was thick with tension as Rhona and Alaric exchanged glances, the weight of the man's words settling heavily over them. Rhona's mind was a whirlwind, trying to piece together the puzzle he had just presented. The outlaws, the soldiers, the shadowy faction. It was all connected, and she was caught right in the middle of it. She could feel the eyes of the others in the room on her, the unspoken judgment and the silent calculations. This was a test of her loyalty, her strength, her resolve. But what was the real goal behind it all? The man at the head of the table had said she was part of something bigger, but what did that mean? What was the faction after? And why had they been watching her for so long? "So, what's the next step?" Rhona asked, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence. She could feel the tension radiating off Alaric beside her. He had been quiet, too quiet, since they had entered the building. He was still processing everything, his eyes flicking nervously from person to person. The man at the table smiled thinly, his eyes glinting with something unreadable. "You've already passed the first test. You survived. Not many do." Rhona didn't flinch. "What else do you want from me?" "We need to know where your loyalties lie," the man said, his voice cold and steady. "The kingdom is on the brink of collapse, and we need people who can fight, who can see beyond the surface of things. You've been trained, you've fought, and you've survived. But that's not enough. You need to prove that you're willing to do what's necessary." Rhona clenched her jaw, her eyes narrowing. "I've fought my whole life to survive, but I'm not a mercenary. I'm not going to follow anyone blindly." The man's smile grew, but it was far from comforting. "You think you have a choice, Rhona? The choice was made the moment you picked up that bow. The outlaws you faced, the soldiers that followed you, they're all part of something much bigger. If you want to stay alive, if you want to protect Alaric, you'll do what's necessary." Rhona felt a surge of anger rise in her chest, but she kept it controlled. She wasn't here to play games. She wasn't going to let this man push her around, no matter how coldly he spoke. "Then what do I have to do?" she asked through gritted teeth. She could already feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her, the knowledge that her next move would shape everything that came after. The man leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. "There's a target we need eliminated. Someone who stands in the way of our plans. Someone who can expose everything we've worked for." "Who?" Rhona's voice was steady, though she was already beginning to feel the weight of his words. She knew what was coming. "One of your own," he replied simply. "A traitor within the kingdom." Rhona's heart skipped a beat. A traitor? Someone who had betrayed the kingdom. Someone she knew? The man continued, unblinking. "There's a nobleman, a figure of influence who has been secretly working against the faction, trying to rally support for the king's rule. He's been marked for elimination, and we need you to be the one to do it." Rhona's mind whirled as the man's words echoed in her ears. A nobleman? A traitor to the cause? The idea of killing anyone, let alone someone she had known or respected, felt foreign to her. She had fought for survival before, but never for this. "I'm not an assassin," she said sharply, her voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and anger. "I won't kill anyone in cold blood, no matter who they are." The man's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. "If you don't, Rhona, you'll be no better than the outlaws who have been hunting you. You'll be a pawn in someone else's game. The choice is simple. Kill the traitor or become a target yourself." Rhona felt her blood run cold. She was trapped. There was no escaping this now. The walls were closing in around her. There was no way out without making a choice, and the weight of that choice hung over her like a sword about to fall. Alaric, who had remained silent up until now, finally spoke, his voice trembling. "Rhona, you don't have to do this. We can still leave. We can still find another way." Rhona turned to him, her heart aching. She could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear she felt. She wanted to protect him, to shield him from the reality of what was happening. But she knew deep down that this wasn't something they could outrun. "I don't know if there is another way, Alaric," she said quietly. "If we leave now, we'll be running forever. They'll catch up with us eventually." She turned back to the man at the table, her gaze hardening. "Who is this nobleman?" she demanded. The man smiled slightly, but there was no kindness in it. "That's the final part of the test. You'll find him soon enough." "Where?" Rhona asked, her voice unwavering. She wasn't backing down now. Whatever the cost, she would face it head-on. The man's gaze flicked to the shadows at the edge of the room, and a figure stepped forward from the darkness. A woman, her face partially hidden by a hood, stepped into the flickering light. Rhona didn't recognize her, but there was something in the woman's posture that screamed authority. "This is Mara," the man said, his voice colder than before. "She'll guide you. She'll ensure that you make the right choice." Mara didn't speak at first. She merely studied Rhona with a piercing gaze, her eyes cold and calculating. Rhona didn't trust her, but there was no avoiding it now. "Follow her," the man commanded. "You'll be given everything you need to complete the task. Do this and we'll give you everything you want. Protection, safety, answers." Rhona's mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. She wanted to run, to take Alaric and disappear into the wilderness. But she knew better. The choice had already been made for them. "Fine," she said finally, her voice cold and resolute. "I'll do it." Mara gave a short nod and turned, leading them out of the building and into the night. The cold wind bit at Rhona's skin, but she barely felt it. All she could think about was what lay ahead. A man's life. Someone she had to kill. Someone she had to betray for the sake of survival. The road ahead was darker than she had ever imagined, and the weight of her decision was already starting to settle over her like a leaden cloak. The night air was sharp as Rhona and Alaric followed Mara through the quiet village streets, the pale light of the moon casting long shadows in every corner. Rhona felt the tension mounting inside her. Each step she took felt like a step deeper into a trap. The air was thick with the weight of the decisions that lay ahead. The nobleman, whoever he was, would soon become the focal point of everything, and she had no idea what she was walking into. Mara led them down a narrow alley, away from the center of the village, and towards the edge where a large, crumbling stone wall loomed in the distance. The further they went, the more isolated they became. Rhona's instincts told her they were walking into danger, but she kept her doubts to herself. There was no point in showing weakness, not now. "Mara," Rhona said, her voice low. "Who is this nobleman? Why is he such a threat?" Mara's pace didn't falter, but she spoke over her shoulder, her voice tight. "He's part of the kingdom's inner circle, someone with enough power to sway public opinion. He's been quietly rallying support for the king, trying to undermine the faction's plans. He's been marked for elimination for months. Rhona felt her heart rate pick up. You want me to kill someone with that kind of power? Her voice betrayed the unease she felt. What if he's not a traitor? What if he's just trying to do the right thing? Mara stopped abruptly and turned to face her, her eyes sharp and calculating. The right thing? You think that's what this is about? You think the kingdom is still the kingdom you remember? No, it's falling apart. And the people in power, those who try to hold on to the old ways, they're the ones standing in the way of progress. He has to be eliminated. There is no room for doubt. Rhona met Mara's gaze, but her mind was already swirling with the implications of what she was being asked to do. Kill a nobleman, a symbol of the old order, a man who was trying to fight for the kingdom's future. Was he truly a traitor? Or was he another pawn in a game she didn't fully understand? What if you're wrong? Rhona asked, her voice steady but filled with doubt. What if he's not part of the faction? What if he's just trying to stop it? Mara's lips curled into a half-smile, but it wasn't reassuring. You'll know soon enough. Just do what you've been trained to do. The decision isn't yours to make. Rhona clenched her fists at her sides, anger flaring within her, but she pushed it down. She was being dragged into something bigger than she had anticipated, something that would change everything. They reached the edge of the village, where a small stone bridge spanned a quiet stream. Beyond the bridge, the woods began, dense and dark. Rhona's senses heightened as they crossed the bridge, the feeling of being watched creeping up her spine. They were being followed. She was sure of it. Mara paused at the far end of the bridge, turning to look at Rhona. This is where we part ways, she said quietly. The rest of the journey is yours to complete. What do you mean? Rhona asked, a note of confusion in her voice. You're not coming with us? Mara's expression softened slightly, but there was still something cold about it. I can't. I have my own role to play, but you'll be fine. Just stick to the plan. Don't ask questions. The moment you deviate, the consequences will be irreversible. Rhona felt a chill run down her spine. The woman's words weren't just a warning, they were a threat. But Rhona didn't have time to dwell on it. They had already come this far. Fine, Rhona said, her voice firm. But if anything goes wrong, I'm coming for you. Mara's smile returned, but it was tinged with something darker. I'll be waiting. With that, Mara turned and melted into the shadows, disappearing into the night. Rhona and Alaric were left standing on the edge of the bridge, the weight of their next steps heavy on them. Rhona turned to Alaric. You ready for this? He didn't answer immediately. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. He was still processing everything that had happened, still reeling from the new reality they found themselves in. But there was no turning back now. I don't know if I'm ready, Alaric said quietly, but I'm with you, Rhona. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'll be by your side. Rhona gave him a tight smile. It was the first time she had seen him truly resolve himself to the situation. He had always been her support, but now, more than ever, they needed each other. They were in this together. Good, she said, her voice steady. Then let's get to work. They moved through the trees, their steps quiet on the soft ground, the shadows of the forest swallowing them up. Rhona's mind raced as they neared their destination. She didn't know what she would find when they arrived. Whether the nobleman was truly a threat or just another pawn in a game that was much bigger than they realized. The deeper they went into the forest, the more Rhona felt the eyes on them. They weren't alone. There were watchers in the trees, and Rhona could feel the pressure mounting. She had become a part of something dark, something bigger than she could have ever anticipated. And now the question was whether she could survive it. The destination came into view after what seemed like hours of walking through the thick underbrush. A small, secluded cabin nestled at the base of a hill. Rhona motioned for Alaric to stay low, and they crouched behind a large rock, watching the cabin. There were no guards visible, but Rhona knew better than to assume it was undefended. The nobleman, if he was truly hiding here, wouldn't be alone. The faction would be watching. They waited in the darkness, the only sound the rustling of the trees above them and the steady, measured breaths of both Rhona and Alaric. The time had come. They would have to act quickly, decisively. Rhona took a deep breath and nodded to Alaric. It was time to make the hardest choice they had ever made. The air was thick with anticipation as Rhona and Alaric crouched behind the rock, watching the cabin in the distance. The moonlight barely filtered through the dense trees, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch forever. Rhona's heart thudded in her chest, each beat loud in her ears. The weight of the decision she had made weighed heavily on her, but there was no turning back now. She had come this far, and now she had to face whatever awaited her inside that cabin. Alaric's breath came in shallow gasps beside her. He was terrified, and Rhona couldn't blame him. This was all new to him. He had never known this kind of danger, never been forced to confront the chaos of the world outside their peaceful life on the farm. But now, they were in the heart of it. "I don't know about this, Rhona," Alaric said quietly, his voice trembling with unease. "This isn't us. We're not like these people." Rhona glanced at him, her expression softening. She understood his fear. She shared it. But they didn't have the luxury of choosing another path. The world had already chosen for them. "We have no choice, Alaric," she whispered back, her voice firm. "We can't just keep running. We have to know what's going on, and we have to stop it before it consumes us." He didn't reply, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. He wasn't ready for this fight, not yet, but she would protect him, just as she had always promised. She would shield him from the worst of it, if she could. The time to act had come. Rhona stood slowly, moving as silently as she could, her bow in hand, ready. Alaric followed, staying close behind her, his movements stiff with nervous energy. They moved through the trees, staying low and avoiding the open spaces. Rhona's eyes darted to every corner, scanning for any sign of movement, but the cabin remained eerily still. When they reached the edge of the clearing, Rhona paused, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the cabin. There were no guards posted outside, but that didn't mean it was unprotected. The nobleman wouldn't be foolish enough to leave himself exposed. Rhona's hand instinctively went to her quiver, pulling out an arrow, knocking it with practiced speed. "We wait," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We make sure we know exactly what we're walking into." They waited in silence, the only sounds the occasional rustling of the trees and the soft crackle of the underbrush beneath their feet. Rhona's senses were sharp. She could feel the tension building inside her, her heart hammering in her chest, but she refused to let fear overtake her. She had faced worse than this. Minutes dragged by, and just as Rhona began to wonder if they had been mistaken, a figure appeared in the doorway of the cabin. He was tall, his back straight, and his movements deliberate, as if he was expecting someone. The door opened slowly, and the man stepped out, scanning the surroundings carefully, his hand resting on the hilt of a sword at his side. Rhona's breath caught in her throat as she saw him clearly in the moonlight. The man was older than she had imagined, with graying hair at his temples and a weathered face that spoke of years spent in the service of the crown. But it wasn't his appearance that caught Rhona's attention. It was the way he moved, the way he held himself. There was no fear in his posture, no hesitation. The nobleman. This was the man they had been sent to eliminate. He turned slowly, walking toward the edge of the cabin and stopping just short of the trees. Rhona's pulse quickened. She hadn't expected him to be so calm, so composed. She had assumed he would be a nervous wreck, a man caught between loyalty and survival. But there was none of that in him. He was a man who knew what he was doing, a man who had accepted his fate. "Are you alone?" A voice called from the shadows, and Rhona's hand tightened on her bow. The nobleman's gaze shifted toward the voice, but he didn't flinch. He didn't move. It was clear that this wasn't his first encounter with those who had been sent to silence him. Another figure stepped from the shadows, a tall woman with dark hair and a sharp, calculating gaze. Rhona's breath caught as she recognized the woman, Mara, the one who had brought them here. "So," the nobleman said, his voice steady, "you've come for me after all. You can't possibly think this will end well." Mara's lips curled into a cold smile. "You've had your time, Alexander. The kingdom no longer belongs to those who resist. You know that as well as I do." Alexander. The nobleman's name was Alexander. Rhona's mind whirled. She had no idea who he truly was, only that he had been marked for death by the faction. But as she listened to the exchange between him and Mara, something shifted inside her. Alexander wasn't just a pawn. He was a man who had stood up for what he believed in. He was the very kind of person Rhona had admired in the stories of the Old Kingdom, the kind of person who would risk everything for what was right. "You'll be buried in history as a fool, Alexander," Mara continued, her voice dripping with disdain. "You think the people will rise against us? You think your pathetic rebellion will make a difference? The crown is already ours." Rhona's heart raced as she took in the conversation. There was so much more at stake here than she had realized. This wasn't just about a traitor. This was about control, about the kingdom's future. And Alexander? He wasn't just some rebel. He was a symbol. "I've done nothing but try to save the kingdom from your kind," Alexander said, his voice still calm, though his eyes burned with defiance. "You think this will end with me? It won't. It's not over yet." Rhona felt a sharp pang in her chest. This was the man she had been sent to kill. But in hearing his words, she realized that killing him wasn't the answer. If the kingdom was truly on the brink of collapse, if the faction had already taken hold, then there was something much bigger at play. Rhona looked at Alaric, who was frozen beside her, eyes wide with disbelief. She had made her choice the moment she entered this game. She couldn't take another life unless she knew the full truth. And now, she was about to make a choice that could change everything. Before she could move, Mara spoke again. "You've been a thorn in our side for too long, Alexander. This ends tonight." The time to act had come. The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, the tension thickening with every passing moment. Rhona stood frozen, her bow still drawn, the arrow nocked and ready. But her heart was no longer in it. The truth had just hit her like a blow to the chest. This wasn't the fight she had signed up for. This wasn't as simple as eliminating a traitor or making her mark in a world of chaos. This was about something much deeper, something far more dangerous. She had been so focused on surviving, on protecting Alaric and herself, that she had never stopped to ask the most important question. What was the real cost of this battle? Who were the true enemies, and what did they really want? Alexander, the man she had been sent to kill, had stood up to Mara and the faction. He wasn't a villain. He was a man fighting for the future of the kingdom, for its soul. And now, she was faced with a choice that would shape the course of her future and the future of everything she held dear. Alaric's voice broke the silence, low and filled with disbelief. "Rhona, what are we doing here? We can't just kill him. This isn't what we came for." Rhona's heart raced as she turned to him. His eyes were wide with confusion, his hands shaking slightly as he looked between her and the nobleman, who was still standing tall despite the danger. Rhona could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her. She had promised to protect him, to keep him safe from the horrors of this world. But now, she was dragging him into the very heart of it. "I know, Alaric," Rhona said, her voice trembling but firm. "But I need to understand. I need to know who the real enemy is." Mara's eyes narrowed, sensing the shift in Rhona's resolve. "You've made your choice, Rhona. You're either with us or you're against us. There's no middle ground. Don't think for a second that you can walk away from this." Rhona's eyes flicked to Alexander, who stood motionless but resolute, as if he had known this moment was coming. His face, though worn with the weight of his years and the struggles he had endured, held a quiet strength that Rhona couldn't ignore. He wasn't the enemy. He was just another pawn in this war. A war that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with power. "I'm not with you," Rhona said, her voice gaining strength. "And I'm not going to be anyone's pawn." The moment the words left her lips, she knew it had been the right decision. The air around them seemed to shift, as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Rhona's hand tightened around the bowstring, her body tensing in preparation for the fight that was inevitably coming. The battle wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about choosing a side in a war that had been brewing long before she had even realized it. Mara's lips curled into a sneer, her eyes cold as ice. "Then you'll die as an enemy, just like the rest." Before Rhona could react, the sound of footsteps echoed through the trees. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, cloaked in darkness, and moving with the ease of someone who had spent their life in the shadows. "Stop," the voice said, and everyone froze. The figure stepped into the moonlight, revealing the unmistakable form of Lucian, the resistance fighter who had warned them of the dangers that lay ahead. Mara's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing as she recognized him. "You, what are you doing here?" Lucian's eyes swept over the gathered figures, Rhona, Alaric, Alexander, and Mara, and the tension in the air thickened. "I've been watching," Lucian said calmly, his eyes steady as he faced Mara. "I know what you're doing, and it stops now." Mara stepped forward, a hand resting on the hilt of her sword. "You've crossed the line, Lucian. You don't understand what's at stake here." "I understand exactly what's at stake," Lucian said, his voice hardening. "You've been playing a dangerous game, Mara, and it's time to end it." Rhona could feel the shift in the air as the tension between the two factions escalated. The time for subtlety had passed. This was no longer a game of strategy or survival. It was a fight for the soul of the kingdom, and everyone in this clearing knew it. Mara's eyes narrowed as she weighed her options, clearly calculating her next move. "You think you can stop me, Lucian? You think you can stop the revolution?" Lucian's eyes flicked to Rhona, and in that moment, she understood. He wasn't here to fight her. He wasn't here to stop her from making the decision she had to make. He was here to offer a choice she had to make for herself. The kingdom's future was in her hands, whether she was ready for it or not. "I don't want to fight," Lucian said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "But I will if I have to. The kingdom's falling apart, Rhona, and you're a part of it. You've always been a part of it. You can't run from this anymore." Rhona's heart pounded in her chest. She had been running for so long, running from the truth, from the reality of the world she had lived in. She had thought she could protect Alaric, protect herself, but this was bigger than any fight she had ever faced. This was about the kingdom. This was about the people they had once sworn to protect. "I don't know who the real enemy is anymore," Rhona whispered, her voice shaky but filled with determination. "But I know I can't be a part of what you're doing, Mara. I won't be." Mara's eyes blazed with fury, but before she could respond, Rhona made her choice. She lowered her bow. The silence that followed was deafening, and in that moment, Rhona knew that whatever happened next, it would change the course of everything. She had chosen a side, not because it was the easy choice, but because it was the only one left. The kingdom was crumbling, and Rhona was no longer just a farmer's wife. She was a player in a war much larger than she could have ever imagined. And now, she would fight for herself, for Alaric, and for the future of the kingdom. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.